and we hold a historic event. My name is Sarah Stern. I'm the founder and president of ANET, the Endowment for Middle East Truth, and this wonderful New York Times best-selling author, Edwin Black, who is a friend of mine, has had certain reasons to be rather frustrated with the United Nations recently, and he said, okay, it's about time. Just like the League of Nations had its moment and it's come and gone, right now, perhaps the United Nations has had its moment that's come and gone. So we are here to look towards a new model, or at least begin the conversation of a covenant of democratic nations. And to start us off here, because this time is very, very limited, I have the honor of welcoming Congressman Trent Franks, who has been a huge, tremendous leader in everything that is right and moral and ethical that the United States Congress has represented since he's come here. He's chaired the Human Rights Caucus. He's chaired the caucus about the electromagnetic pulse. He is the chairperson of the U.S.-Israel Allies Caucus here, and he is a dear, dear friend of all of us in this room, of ANET and every other organization that's represented here. Congressman Trent Franks.
You hear a lot of overblown recommendations or introductions, and you've certainly heard one of the best today. That's about as over the top as you can get. And I love Sarah Stern. If I weren't married, and she weren't, I think she's totally wonderful. And she has been such a committed voice to this cause. And I just have the deepest, deepest respect and appreciation for her. And Edwin Black, I think he's one of the great intellectuals of our day. I've had the privilege of having him before the Constitution Subcommittee. And I, again, have just the deepest respect for him. There's so many friends I see. I see Noah Silverman back there. I just see a lot of wonderful people I've known for a long time. And I don't want to get started because I can't possibly name you all, but you're in the right place this morning, as I was telling Edwin just a few moments ago. This is a critically important issue. The United Nations started out with a noble charter. They were given the charge after the Nazis decimated peace and human dignity in the world. They were given the charge to try to bring us together as a noble forum. But the United Nations has not only failed their charter, they have distinctively moved in the opposite direction and done actual harm in the opposite direction of what their original charter was. They've become an anti-American, anti-Semitic, anti-democratic, anti-freedom mob. And I will tell you, I have a bill, may not get all the way through the process, but I have a bill to defund because I really truly believe that this organization has just disgraced the civilized world. I know those are strong words, but I'm afraid that they fit perfectly. And it's, I think, an example of nobility on your part to be here, because you know that we need some type of alternative to where we would have a covenant of democratic nations rather than a group, again, a mob that has no real commitment to human freedom or human dignity. Now, I know all of you know that my commitment to Israel is very deep and very strong. They are the most important ally I believe we have in the world for a number of different reasons. And yet they become the target of the United Nations on an incessant, relentless basis. And it has just gotten to where it's just gotten to the point where almost no reasonable person can stand by and not be heard. The resolution that they passed, I think it's 2334 was it, that they passed this last December was a disgrace. And Mr. Obama did this in the safety of a lame duck session, and I think he not only disgraced the United States of America when he did this, but he solidified his place in history as the one president of the United States that overtly betrayed the state of Israel. Heavy words. I wish they weren't true. So it's important that we come together and seek an alternative. It's time to repeal and replace the United Nations. I hope that somehow we can come up with something that is parallel to the original goal that they were given. The original charge that they were given was to bring us together as a world and have a forum to where we can talk out our differences. I believe in that with everything in me. But again, this organization has gone off the rails. When you look at what their Committee on Human Rights is, and look at those the people that represent that, it's just unbelievable. I'm honored to be here with all of you. I wish I hadn't been late, and I wish I didn't have to go early, but I do. But I just thank Edwin Black and Sarah Stern and all of the noble people here. And I hope that this is a seed that will germinate and grow. And I think these are unique days. I mean, if I had tried to predict, in fact, I did try to predict the events of the last year and came woefully short of accuracy. So let me just say to you that these are times when we can dream again and that we can hope for better days, and I do hope for these better days. And it's time that we begin to hold the United Nations accountable, and that the world community that is dedicated to human dignity and human freedom stands up and says, no more. We need something different. We either need to have the most radical change in the United Nations, or again, we need to repeal and replace that organization. Thank you all very much.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending. I want to thank, of course, Sarah, my friend and colleague, Edwin for inspiring this event, and Congressman Franks for his important remarks. I think when it comes to the United Nations, that every so often you have an incident or an episode that reveals perfectly the contradictions and shortcomings of the UN. The most recent example of that was last month when, as the Congressman pointed out, the Security Council passed Resolution 2334, very one-sided condemnation of Israel for the stasis in the peace process with the Palestinians. And one of the ambassadors at the Security Council that day talked about his pleasure at seeing this important resolution on this critical issue of Israeli settlements going through just as his term on the Security Council was coming to an end. The gentleman, I know it sounds like that could have actually come from an American representative, but the gentleman in question was in fact the ambassador of Venezuela. So here you have, at the UN, I think, really the appalling spectacle of a representative of a state that has, particularly over the last 4 or 5 years since the death of Hugo Chavez, spiraled downwards into a crisis of human rights abuse, of food shortages, of inflation, of corruption, of drug smuggling. Venezuela has gone in 15 years from being one of the wealthiest, most successful and most consensual countries in Latin America to becoming Latin America's equivalent of Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe. And what happens? This administration that has just gone out of office actively colludes with a regime like this in order to get a resolution passed at the UN Security Council that condemns Israel. There are lots of other countries that are not normal by any standards, by any civilized standards that we treat as normal at the UN. Because there is, I think, an inherent contradiction in the UN. The preamble to the UN Charter talks about the dignity of the human person. But Chapter 2.1 of the UN Charter talks about the sovereign equality of states. And unfortunately, what we have seen since 1945 is the elevation of the sovereign equality principle, time and again, over the principle of individual human dignity. This is why you have a situation in which states that are basically glorified concentration camps with flags on, like North Korea, get to have an equal voice with Australia and Canada and the United States and, yes, Israel. The other way that this, but even with the sovereign equality principle, there's still a very, very strong element of hypocrisy. Why? Because the only state that actually has its sovereignty chipped away at on a daily basis at the United Nations is sadly the State of Israel. The State of Israel is the only UN member state that has to contend on a daily basis with the fact that there are United Nations agencies dedicated to demonising and delegitimizing it. Some of you will know in 1975 that the United Nations General Assembly passed a notorious resolution which equated Zionism and racism, and that was repealed in 1991. Most people think that was the end of the story. It actually was not the end of the story. On that same day in 1975, a bunch of infrastructure was created at the UN. The Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, which is serviced by the Division for Palestinian Rights, which is housed under the Department for Political Affairs. These bodies, created on the same day as the Zionism is Racism Resolution, are still in existence. They still have their mandates renewed every year. And everything from sponsoring Palestine Days on November the 27th at the UN building, international conferences for non-governmental organisations. At the same time, you don't see a division for Tibetan rights. You don't see a division for Kurdish rights. There is a very good argument to be made not to have divisions for rights for any particular nation, because the UN is meant to be a broad-based agency. But of course, the demands of politics at the time in 1975, the demands of the Soviet-dominated Warsaw Pact and non-aligned groups meant that by sheer force of numbers, that they could push these discriminatory measures against Israel through. So I think that offers one important explanation for why the UN continues to remain focused on a healthy, mature, vibrant democracy in one of that happens to exist in one of the most impossible regions of the world, and why it ignores or colludes in or fails to stop human rights atrocities and genocide, whether we're talking about Cambodia in the 1970s, Bosnia in the 1990s, Rwanda in the 1990s, or Syria now, where there are 500,000 people who have basically been murdered in this war. The UN has significantly failed to stop all of this. I think a lot of us have toyed with the idea that Edwin has had here of a covenant of democratic nations, but I think it takes somebody with the chutzpah and with the charisma of Edwin to actually articulate this idea. I'm glad we're at the beginning of the conversation. I think there's a lot that has to be clarified, but I want to end by thanking Edwin for recognising the importance of starting this discussion now and moving forward, because the present situation is, I would say, untenable. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Well, it's a pleasure to join these distinguished people and this distinguished audience. I think we've heard some compelling reasons here. It seems to me that right now, as England looks at a Brexit from the European Union, the question is, should we consider an exit? Should we consider an American exit, this time for the United Nations? Yes. In other words, we can talk about cutting funds to the United Nations, we can talk about holding back, but really the issue is, and I like the term from Congressman Franks, repeal and replace. The issue is that it's not just about holding back a little bit of money until the United Nations can make some trivial reform and then giving money back by way of back dues. But really the question is, can we do better? And to me, the question isn't whether the United Nations mission and values are important enough that we should continue to support them, despite all of its misconduct, which we've heard about already this morning, but rather that the goals and mission of the United Nations are so important that we need to consider replacing it because it has so singularly failed to address it. Think about why we have a United Nations, or at any rate what the hopes were 7 decades ago when it was first established. They were not trivial goals. The idea behind the United Nations is to free the world of the scourge of war. Certainly an important goal, but hardly one to which the United Nations has had any degree of success. To promote social progress, to encourage treaty compliance, And most importantly of all, I say important because this is not just the reason why it was established, but the reason why we need to think about doing something better. To reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and nations large and small. That's why it was established, and its failure to address it from Rwanda to Cambodia to Syria is a reason why we have to reconsider. It is not unrelated that on the one hand, the United Nations has dealt single-mindedly, obsessively with Israel, and that it has failed on the other hand to address these other countries, that at a time of genocide in Cambodia, it was concerned only about condemning Israel in the Zionism is racist talk. It is because the obsession with Israel as the single exception to the general rule against singling out countries has essentially immunized the other countries. It has created a kind of fig leaf behind which dictators can hide their misdeeds. By having a United Nations and a Human Rights Council that is charged with protecting human rights, and which is very actively attacking supposed abuses in Israel, it gives traitors, dictators around the world an excuse. It gives them protection. It gives them immunity. And in a sense, when we look back, it's hard to imagine that it could have happened any other way. When you have not an organization of democracies, but rather an organization of undemocratic countries with a small number of democracies thrown in. Consider the Human Rights Council, the organization which is charged with protecting the human rights of people the world over, but which focuses only on Israel. Think about the expertise that the member states of the Human Rights Council have. In the year 2017, these great experts on human rights include Burundi, China, Cuba, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and the United Arab Emirates. When the United Nations fails to deal with human rights in any country other than Israel, it is not malfunctioning. That has become its function. That is what it does. It attacks democracies and democracies only and gives dictators an excuse to persecute their people. When we consider repealing and replacing, it's not something that we should take lightly. The last thing that we want is a situation in which we will lose our veto and pull out of the United Nations and not have anything in place that deals with these important values, these important rights, and then perhaps want to return to the United Nations at some later point, but in a weaker position. If we do repeal and replace, we need to start to work right away, working with other democracies who share our values of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, individual rights, respect for minorities, working with other countries to establish a framework within which we can review, consider, replace, and or strengthen those treaties and conventions that have a role and have a place. But we really have to start now. This is really the time to think big, not to simply tinker with the existing system, not to simply make threat to the United Nations over a particular resolution or other. The problem is not one or two resolutions that make the news and that we read about. It is the entire system which has not only disgracefully attacked certain democracies, but which has failed in its broader mission. The time is to ask, can we not do something better? Can we not create an institution that really will protect the fundamental rights for which the UN was initially built? Thank you.
As Ben mentioned, on November 10th, 1975, the United Nations passed the infamous Zionism is Racism resolution. Although the resolution was repealed, as Ben had said, in 1991, that same ugly sentiment is, and let's name it for what it actually is called anti-Semitism. Remains healthy, alive, and kicking within the hallowed halls of the United Nations. That same ugly, abhorrent sentiment gave birth last month to United Nations Security Council Resolution 2334. which would like to have Israel whittle itself down to the indefensible borders of the pre-1967 conflict, borders which, by the way, Abba Eban of the Labour Party had dubbed the Auschwitz lines because they are so indefensible. This, in a rapidly imploding, increasingly Islamicized and increasingly radicalized Middle East, where Israel, let's face it, is our one and only democratic ally and one of our greatest national security assets in that radically imploding region of the world. Israel actually sits right at the seam line protecting Western values from the world of radical Islam. All of this gives powerful fuel to the boycott, divest, and sanctions movement, in which to demonize Israel and to set forth standards which any other nation, if faced by the same difficulties, simply could never even aspire to achieve. The structure within the United Nations simply has the deck of cards stacked against Israel. Israel, because of where it's physically located, has been rejected from belonging to any regional working group. In contrast to this, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation is composed of 56 states plus the Palestinian Authority, and it is the largest single voting group and regional group or voting group in the United Nations, and they vote en masse. They also tend to garner the votes of the unallied and rogue nations of the world. It is no wonder then, as President Trump's designate as our ambassador to the UN, Governor Nikki Haley of South Carolina, said in her confirmation hearings last week, nowhere has the UN's failure been more consistent and more outrageous than in its bias against our close ally Israel. Governor Haley continues to explain that in the just completed 70th session of the UN General Assembly, 20 resolutions have been passed against Israel and only 6 against the rest of the world's nations combined. In the past 10 years, the Human Rights Council has passed 62 resolutions condemning the reasonable actions Israel must take to defend its citizens. Meanwhile, Governor Haley continues, the world's worst human rights abusers, Syria, Iran, and North Korea, receive far fewer condemnations. This cannot continue. America contributes 22% of the UN's overall budget, far more than any other country. This is Governor Haley's words. We are a generous nation, but we must ask ourselves, what good is being accomplished by the disproportionate contribution? Are we getting what we pay for? Excellent question, Governor Haley. The answer is a definitive and a resounding no. How dare despotic, ruthless, tyrannical regimes governed by the likes of Bashar al-Assad, which has seen over the slaughter of approximately 500,000 of his own people, purport to pass judgment on the one little democratic nation in the Middle East? Or how dare the Iranian Ayatollahs and their lovely quote-unquote moderate president Hassan Rouhani of Iran, which has the highest per capita execution rate in the world, where routinely gays, dissidents, and religious minorities, as well as women who've been raped, are tortured mercilessly and summarily hung. Or that brutal little despot, Kim Jong-un of North Korea, which enjoys all of the wonderful human rights and liberties of perhaps Theresienstadt concentration camp, where people, including the little tyrant's uncle, are executed at his mere whim. All of these nations gang up and ironically single out for chastisement the one nation, Israel, which is the beacon of democracy, of Western liberal values, of tolerance, human rights, and the rule of law in that rapidly imploding region of the world known as the Middle East. In 1945, after the atrocities of World War II, of which anti-Semitism did not play an insignificant role, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a vision that there would be an international body for nations to resolve their conflicts without resorting to war. Unfortunately, just as the League of Nations had proven to be a failure, the United Nations has now proven to be an abject, abysmal failure. And rather than outline ugly racist sentiments such as anti-Semitism, this is an institution that feeds upon it. It is now time, therefore, to begin having this conversation of finally dissolving the United Nations and replacing it with a covenant of democratic nations who share our common values of democracy, of Western liberal values of tolerance, human rights, and the rule of law. Thank you very much.
Well, I have to say I'm very flattered by Sarah's generous auditory introduction of me. But as I stand up here today, I have to confess to you that I probably deserve execution. Why? Because the Bible describes the case, which the rabbis say has never happened, of the rebellious son. And as I stand up before you here today, some might think of me as being a rebellious son. Why is that? Because my father, of blessed memory, Dr. Isaac Lewin, who was really a role model for me in terms of working on behalf of Jews all over the world, and who came here in 1941, came to the United States, and immediately immersed himself in rescuing Jews from all over the world who had survived the Holocaust. He, my father, was a great believer in the United Nations. He was a non-governmental representative of what some might call the ultra-Orthodox community, how good is Israel World Organization. And he spent many, many years attempting to present the position of the religious Jewish community to the United Nations. There are books of his speeches to the United Nations, Religious Jewry and the United Nations, 10 Years of Hope, which were really collections of addresses he had made to the United Nations, various organizations, Human Rights Commission, UNESCO, on behalf of Jews. In the introduction to one of the volumes, written in December of 1952, and let me tell you, by the way, my father learned English after he came to the United States. He spoke with an accent, but delivered his speeches in the United Nations. And as a teenager, it was my job in the family to be correcting his English texts so that they would be appropriate in terms of the talks that he would give to the United Nations. He wrote in December of 1952, "In times when the world seeks ways for international society to be organized on the basis of friendly cooperation of all men, let the voice of religious Jewry be heard. It is the voice of a group of people who believe that the Word of God, as reflected in the teachings of the prophets and the old Jewish sages, is still the strongest foundation for the happy future of mankind." This was the great that has been dashed by the terrible things that this organization, which my father admired, looked up to. One of the people whom he idolized was Eleanor Roosevelt, whose acts, when she was involved with the United Nations, were supportive of the Jewish people and of Israel. And now the United Nations has turned into an agent of destruction for Western civilization, and for Israel. So, as I say, when Sarah and Edwin came up with the idea for this meeting this morning and asked me whether I would participate, I thought again of my personal history with regard to the United Nations, with the efforts that my father, of blessed memory, had spent really years of labor trying to build this dream of a great society, of a world that would be looking for peace and friendship and brotherhood. But even in his time, the amazing thing is that he could write and speak of the fact that the World Muslim Congress, this is in 1969, he said, before this honorable assembled body, they heard the representative of the World Muslim Congress who stated that the Jews persecute the Arabs, and that in the state of Israel there was no equality for Arabs, and that the Al-Aqsa Mosque was burned so that the Jews might build in its place a new third temple. My father said these assertions are so totally incorrect and without any basis in fact that they daze and astound the listener. That was at a time when the United Nations, the rest other than the World Muslim Congress, was receptive and could hear and appreciate these views and in fact attack and condemn anti-Semitism. Today, instead of condemning anti-Semitism, the United Nations has turned into an organ that supports anti-Semitism and that seeks the destruction of the Jewish people of Israel. So, whatever replaces it, it's clear, and I said it to Edwin when he asked me, I said it is clear that it is time to write the obituary of the United Nations. The United Nations deserves an obituary, but in the Jewish tradition, it does not deserve Kaddish. Why does it not deserve Kaddish? Because the United Nations committed suicide when it adopted Resolution 2334. It wrote its own death warrant. So today, I'm happy to join the beginnings of a group that would spell the end of the United Nations, the end of its funding, the end of its presence, the end of its significance in the world order. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Edwin Black, and thank you all for coming. And looks like we have a full house, even though it was a lot of rain and a lot of wind out there. I would like to thank all the people who made this event possible. I can't list all their names, and whoever I say will not be in order of importance. I'd like to mention Sarah Stern, who is such a tireless warrior for truth and justice. I would like to thank Stand With Us and the Emersons for making this possible, as well as many other groups, including the Israel-American Council and many others who have helped me bring the threads together to weave this new international fabric. Thanks to the Trent Franks was indispensable in this, especially his staff. There were many words used to describe Trent Franks. All of them were accurate. One was left out. He is among the most moral of legislators that I know in this city. And there are so few to know, but he is at the front. Thank you, Trent Franks. Wonderful panelists here representing people of letters, people of conscience, people of jurisprudence. Nathan Lewin, who needs no introduction. Americanist the honorary president of the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, and I think either he and or his firm have been up to the Supreme Court 28 times? 28 times.
28 in Hebrew spells koach. Strength.
28, and he's a numerologist also, he said that means strength. And he's got the strength, and I know he's got the strength, because on the day the knifings started in Jerusalem, he and I were together. He said, we're going to the Kotel, and we're going through the old city, and I couldn't keep up with this guy. So, Ben Cohn, who is just coming down from New York for this event, the Israel Project, I can tell you, Ben is a great thinker. The Israel Project is very important to understanding what is going on in the Middle East, and they've been leaders with regard to the Iranian nuclear agreement or disagreement, however you like it. There's Ken Marcus, who's a former director of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He has a complete here in his personal capacity, but he is also the executive director of Louis Brandeis Institute, which fights anti-Semitism and fights for human rights. So I will make some very brief remarks because it's hard to follow these eminent speakers. And then I'll take some questions, I'll throw some concepts out, I'll ask for very short answers because we only have the room for a limited number of times. There's a lot happening outside of these doors, as you might know. The League of Nations began after World War I, actually before World War I ended, as an attempt to bring together a sense of vengeance, a sense of justice, a desire for peace, a recognition of self-determination and minority rights, all driven by the greed of oil. It all came together. That's in fact how these nations in the Middle East were made. We're not looking at ancient nations, we're looking at the Ottoman Empire. And as Winston Churchill said, oil don't grow in England. And the Ottoman Empire was invaded even before World War I was declared. And of course, the lines were drawn specifically with regard, and the mandates were given to create nations where nations never existed on the basis of national identity, tribal identity, and the need to take the oil and create the pipelines. So you all know about the League of Nations. The League of Nations immediately failed. The League of Nations did not do anything to promote peace. It's true that the League of Nations did undertake some border reconciliation talks, especially in Latin America and other places, but it presided over the expansion of Hitlerism. It dissected Czechoslovakia, which was a true democracy. It never even fought the war against the Nazis. And then that was fought by the Allies. And the Allies and the United States only joined because Japan blocked us at Pearl Harbor, and then the treaty obligations of the Axis made Germany declare war on us, so we reciprocated. So the United Nations was a successor entity to the League of Nations. And the United Nations, in fact, $8 billion in assets was actually turned over to the United Nations from the League of Nations, the ones that were not restored to its original members. The United States was never a member of the League of Nations because Article 10 called for enforcement or joint action or intervention, and American Congress would not ratify that. That was in the days when a treaty was still approved by the Congress. The United Nations has overseen, really, an injustice They've created two classes of refugees and done nothing to eliminate the second class. For instance, when my parents were in a displaced persons camp, their refugee status ended the day that they came to the United States, and I am not a Polish refugee. I'm not a European refugee. I'm a Chicago boy. But a second class of refugee was created for the purpose of perpetuating and creating a new breed of refugee, where refugee status and victimhood is given as a birthright from generation to generation, and that refugee is the Palestinian refugee. Even Syrian refugees today do not have the same rights as Palestinian refugees. And nothing is being done to take these refugees out of their camps. 850,000 Jews were summarily expelled in the early 1950s, penniless, from Iraq and the entire the entire Muslim world in the Middle East. And these people were quickly absorbed. Why is there a refugee camp in Ramallah, for heaven's sakes? Walk out across the street. So there are it has created injustice. It has never been involved in creating peace in the Middle East. The Camp David Accords were not conducted in Geneva. They were conducted in Maryland. And they were not convened by the United Nations. They were convened by a president. When the disengagement occurred between Egypt and Israel, the United Nations blocked a peacekeeping force. And so that peacekeeping force, I was one of the first ones to visit their station in the middle of the Sinai, was known as the MFO, the Multinational Forces Organization. Several countries got together. The Zionism is racism. Resolution of 1975 made it clear that the United Nations was an organization that was actually determined to remap, to redefine and recreate facts and history, and a Jewish national movement known as Zionism was now called a racist movement, while all other national movements were elevated. The UN, of course, has been involved in peacekeeping missions, and many of their peacekeeping forces, especially in Africa, have been accused of unbelievable rapes, and also in Central Europe, unbelievable rapes. When it came time to defending people in Srebrenica, that did not occur. When it came time to creating an international criminal court, most of the democratic countries do not even subscribe to the so-called Statute of Rome, which creates the International Criminal Court. They aren't bound by it. Who is bound by it? It's mainly a lot of African nations. And who is judging them? Europe, which starting in the late 19th century decided to invade the continent, engaged in the worst type of colonialism. And so we have Belgium, which oversaw the cutting off of hands of people who did not gather up rubber fast enough. And so we have Germany, who in 1904, 5, and 6 mass murdered 80% of the Herreros and Namas in a dress rehearsal for the Holocaust, including cattle cars and death camps. They are judging Africa, and they are judging everyone else. It is, in fact, the granddaughters and the grandsons of those who perpetrated the Holocaust who now pass a resolution like 2334 and applaud on that day. Okay, there's a lot of reasons to talk about why the UN has failed so miserably in its mission that it is time to call it quits. Even on the day that 2334 was passed, how many hundreds of thousands were on the move from Aleppo and other parts of Syria. China establishing extraterritorial rights in the with these artificial militarized islands. Nothing being done to stop the Syrian and Iranian and Hezbollah actions, which are contrary to UN resolution. And so we have a concept. International law. Is it law? Is it? When you think of law, you think of something that you don't have a choice about. You can't commit murder in New Jersey and then decide whether or not you will be judged under that law. But under international law, you have the choice whether to observe it or not observe it, to consider yourself under the jurisdiction or not under the jurisdiction. And if you're in the United States, you can bomb a hospital in Afghanistan and not self-indict. If you're China, you can extend extraterritorial islands into the sea and not self-indict. If you are Russia, you can enable barrel bombs and not self-indict. But if you're Israel and you're having a garden built 5 feet down the hill, you're a war criminal. Okay. None of the people up here represent the Covenant of Democratic Nations because it doesn't exist. We're not the organization. We're not even the committee. We are simply the beginning of the conversation. Many people said, let's take our marbles and our checkbook and leave the UN. That is insufficient because the UN will then be an even more unmoderated satellite of the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Countries. We must actually reform, update, readopt, strike down, and clarify new international law based on what has happened before, in the same way that Jim Crow, segregation, was updated, reformed, clarified, struck down during the Civil Rights era and indeed each year in the 21st century. Whether we decide to call this the Covenant of Democratic Nations, the Alliance of Democratic Nations, a bunch of Democratic Nations, whatever it isn't enough to leave, we must replace. Defund and replace. That is the movement. We are starting the conversation. And thank you very much for letting me make some remarks on this historic day. And so now I'm going to ask for a 1-minute response from Nat Lewin, who actually was the one who said to me, is there anything really as international law? I'd like to put the question to him. Nat, is there anything such as international law?
I've got an argument coming up in a Court of Appeals on Wednesday, in which they've given me 3 minutes. So I am not an international lawyer. I am not an expert in international law. I can't begin to really answer Edwin's question except to say that the law that I know about is universally enforceable. In other words, in terms of creating a system of law within a state, within a government, you have the enforcement of that law. With regard to international law, it is what apparently appears to be politically correct at the time. And therefore my answer to Edwin is no, I don't believe there is such a thing as a body of enforceable international law, notwithstanding the fact that the United Nations purports to announce very discriminatory, very erroneous rulings that they claim have the effect of international law.
Ken, no provision was made in this democratic endeavor of the United Nations to be governed by democratic countries. And so now, the General Assembly, even to a large extent the Security Council, is dominated by countries that don't respect women, Jews, Christians, the democracy, and personal freedoms. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's the fundamental contradiction at the basis of the United Nations, which is that it is an association of countries that disregard the very principles which it was founded to establish. So why should we be surprised when they do it so poorly? Our country was established in significant part based on the premise that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed. That is why American sovereign law has its legitimacy. The problem is that the United Nations does not draw its legitimacy from the consent of anybody but the countries of which it's a part. Some are democracies, but most are not. And that creates a very significant problem for the legitimacy of these international conventions. Now, of course, to the extent that the United Nations signs treaties that are the basis for law, it puts us in an awkward position, which is that we are binding ourselves to illegitimate, undemocratic processes and processes that lack the basis of our own law. So I would say to the extent that we can build institutions based on democratic nations, we have a very significant improvement, and that I think is the only way going forward to advance the values for which the UN was supposed to make a contribution. Thank you.
Ben, if we limit the membership of the Covenant of Democratic Nations to truly democratic nations, someone may ask, what's a democratic nation?
Well, I have to say that it's good to be asked that question when you're in the legislative assembly of the greatest democracy in the world. I think that what fundamentally makes a nation democratic is that its people live in freedom from fear. I think that's basically the great dividing line between democracies on the one hand and authoritarian and totalitarian regimes on the other. We all know the obvious democracies. The United States is one of them, most of the European countries, certainly the state of Israel, even some countries in Africa have made remarkable strides towards democracy. Equally, we know those states that are definitively, manifestly non-democratic. We talked about some of them here today. For example, Iran, and for example, North Korea, which calls itself the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So there's also, there's also a practical note there for membership applications, which is that any country that calls itself democratic should probably be excluded from membership. Since generally speaking, that's the historical experience. The German Democratic Republic and the much mourned East Germany was known as the German Democratic Republic. I think what you have is a much more complicated issue with countries that have democratic foundations and are sliding into authoritarianism. I think Turkey is a very good example of that now, particularly over the last few months. Since the coup or alleged coup, the very murky coup that took place in Istanbul, you've now seen a real power grab by President Erdogan to essentially turn Turkey into what he calls an executive presidency. I think many of us see it as being much more on the Russian model than on the American one. So there you're going to have some issues in terms of our countries that were democratic that become authoritarian. Do they stay or do they go? Now, just as in the same way that you can, in theory, have a member expelled from the United Nations, I think you could, in theory, have a member admitted or expelled on the basis of their fealty to democratic principles in a new body like this one. But I want to conclude by saying that the definition of what a democracy is keeps evolving. And I think that if you have a new United Nations, whatever you call it, the Covenant of Democratic Nations, the Alliance of Democratic Nations, but if you have a new global body, that one of its mandates will be to strengthen democratic institutions, to strengthen respect for democracy, to strengthen the rule of law in all its member states, no longer to say, you are sovereign, and therefore what you do in your own borders is your own business. That is a principle that we have to junk. That is a principle that I think this new body will junk, and in doing so, will enable democracies, because we've rather forgotten this, I have to say, not just in America, but in Europe as well, that will enable the citizens of democracies to realise that they live pretty exceptional lives, that they live lives free from fear, and that they should be saying, because I say this, I think many people in this room would agree with me, that I have no shame in advocating liberal democracy as a model for the rest of the world. I do think it is a superior form of government. The reason is that we're all in here. We're having this conversation. And we're living without the fear that someone is going to come, as would happen in Turkey, in Istanbul, or in Moscow, certainly in Pyongyang, running through that door and arrest a lot of us for having the wrong type of conversation. Thank you very much.
And the answer is, it's actually on our website at covenantofdemocraticnations.org, which is operated by the non-existent Covenant of Democratic Nations. In my basement. And the answer is, it says that probably we should. But the idea of leaving the United Nations and leaving a body of so-called international law to be used as a cover for further undemocratic acts is untenable. So I see the Covenant of Democratic Nations is not only doing something better, but undoing the damage, rewriting the international law, and with a group of nations coming together, and once again we say under international law, any number of countries can come together and make an international agreement. When these new countries come together, and whether they are limited to 6 or 10, and remember the UN Security Council is only 5+1, the P5, then they will make a new body of law, and non-democratic countries will be able to join as observers, but not vote. Because we don't ask the undemocratic nations to interpret and vote on democratic matters. And the broken democracies can participate. I give you greetings from the Lebanese Information Council, which could not be here. But Lebanon is a perfect example of a democracy that is broken and struggling to repair itself. So they would have an associate membership, and they might have even some type of voting rights. But the idea is to be inclusive for democratic principles, and sunsetting, whether it takes 5 years or 10 years, is probably a good idea. I would also like to see a constitution. Or a charter, so that the principles could not be overridden by a hijacking. There could, of course, be an undemocratic regime take over a country in the way that the Weimar Republic was overtaken by Nazi Germany, in the way that France was bifurcated into a fascist zone and an occupied zone. And so it might be wise to have a sunsetting, and that is why it is something that we are asking. I'm going to say we are completely non-partisan, we're not bipartisan, we're non-partisan, but since we're making history, let's understand that this discussion could not have taken place last year. This discussion, we have the impetus now by the horrible acts that have occurred in the United Nations, and an impetus now of a nation which is becoming aware, and United States government which is becoming willing to understand that it's time for a complete defund and replace movement. And we are adding the word replace to that defund verb. Now, I believe that the organization that I don't represent but advocate for, that organization will take some time to organize itself. It'll require an international conference And at that international conference, it'll have to be an official one, which we hope the United States will host, will then have to lead to an international convention amongst these democratic nations. And that international convention will then result in a new international law. And that convention will then lead to the third aspect, which is the treaty, which nations will adopt. So I would believe certainly that all the prior acts of the United Nations and its agencies, UNESCO, the Human Rights Council, 2334, all of these prior acts will have to be either readopted, vetoed, struck down, clarified, or made sense of. And that is what all law needs. All law needs to be updated. People are still talking about the 1906 Hague Regulations defining occupation, which were put forward by the Tsar after the Franco-Prussian War, and which were in fact never correctly, never finally adopted. We have the Fourth Geneva Convention, which has Article 49, talks about torture and expulsion, because it was based upon what the Nazis did. They moved people back and forth on trains, organized by IBM, which of course organized the Holocaust for the Nazis, and they worked them to the death. And they equate sentence 7 of that with the idea of opening up a seltzer plant with equal pay for equal wages, with a mosque in it, and halal and kosher food and full equality. They have misapplied, misinterpreted, and distorted any attempted international law and created a fake history, where historians know that the Palestinians were the Jewish Zionists until the 1960s, when the Arabs took that name with the first Palestinian National Council, the people now known as the Palestinians. And so even now, we will have to untangle the falsities established by the United Nations. So the answer is, we have an opportunity now, we can seize that now, and your question is very fitting. Thank you very much.